Now we're going to open up the floor for questions. Jacob is kindly here to answer those questions for you. I want to remind everyone of some of the ground rules for asking questions. Once you get to the mic, please state your name, if you're a journalist, what outlet you're working for, and please ask a question, not a statement. Jacob is kindly here to answer all your questions for you, so be respectful of not taking too much time so that as many people can ask questions as they want. So go ahead, please line up at the mic. There's a mic in the back. If you're up in... My mic's up. There we go. If you're up in front, you can raise your hand if you want, but best to just line up to the mic in the back so we can all hear you. And no one's at the mic? Go ahead.
Is it up in here?
Yep.
I'm not a journalist. I work for no one. I was just wondering, I'm a fellow Californian, by the way. I was just wondering how many of these whistleblowers could ever have a life after all the governments of the world team up on them, and where they could go to live. I don't know.
Yeah, I think one of the wonderful things about Snowden, one of the things we see, is that Snowden has a life with his girlfriend in Moscow, which is not ideal, but he has a life. And this is a great improvement compared with Chelsea Manning, who was locked up in a federal prison for telling us about war crimes. Obviously, the solution, though, is not to go somewhere else. It's to fix, in this case, the United States, or where we are in each place. And that's a very, very difficult thing to do. But part of that is to pass whistleblower protection laws that actually enable people like Snowden to come forward in a lawful way where they will be protected and be able to affect change. And that is a key thing that was missing for Thomas Drake, for Bill Binney, for Chelsea Manning, and a number of other people.
Thank you. Next question, please.
I'm Rekha Shankar, Asian Age India. I want to first thank you for the privilege of showing us this film. I mean, Snowden just comes across like a superhero, I think. I have so many questions. The first was, how safe do you feel? Like, you are safe in Germany, and how comfortable does Snowden feel in Russia? Did you ever expect to win the Oscar? What does Snowden feel after winning the Oscar? What are your plans after winning this Oscar with the film?
So 3 questions for you there. How safe do you feel, and how does Snowden feel after winning the Oscar?
I'm going to Euro Disneyland. I feel relatively safe in Germany for a couple of reasons. It's not very clear in the film, but I was the person that brought the Angela Merkel story to Spiegel. And that, I think in some ways it helped because we won the Henry Nannen Prize, which is the highest press prize in Germany for that story. And that helped because it created a really serious diplomatic incident where it's clear that the political crime of espionage can't be labeled on journalists for such a story. It's just not possible. That's in the public interest. They're crappy spies. They got caught. And that makes me feel very safe in Germany because it's very clear the Germans and the German government feel that even though it's annoying to learn that fact in public, it is in the public interest to know that those kinds of criminal activities are ongoing against the German government and against the German people. So I feel very safe in Germany. But I also have to consult with a lawyer every single time I want to travel somewhere. I had to consult with an extradition specialist to decide to come to Thailand, for example, to scuba dive on vacation. But I feel relatively safe here, knowing that in the end, there really is no safety when you deal with intelligence agencies. And the right thing to do is not necessarily the safe thing. And you have to optimize, I think, for the right thing. So if someone's going to bring some harm to myself, to Laura, to someone else, it's just how it is. We should do everything we can to maximize the costs on that. But journalists, especially in this room, I'm sure are aware, when you work in a dangerous place, or in countries without strong rule of law, or dealing with countries without strong rule of law, like the United States, who assassinates their own citizens with drones, those are the stakes. And Snowden was aware of that quite clearly when he came out, and part of what makes him, as you said, a superhero is the knowledge that he needs to do this and he needs to feel good in doing it, not just in the result. And I think that he does, and it's very clear. And I hope that he's safe in Russia. I've actually never met him in person, never been to Russia, for example. Been to Hong Kong, but not at the same time. So I feel relatively safe in knowing that if your goal in optimizing your life is just safety, we can't be Edward Snowden. But if your goal is something higher than that, I think the important thing to realize is that he's actually not a superhero. He's each and every one of us when we have a moral outlook and go into organizations with the right frame of reference and then actually realize when something's wrong that we have to do something drastic. He's, personally one of my favorite heroes, but one thing I want to make clear is also, without Julian Assange of WikiLeaks and Sarah Harrison of WikiLeaks, this film would not have been made. It is impossible that Snowden would be free today. They helped him to actually exercise in a concrete way his political and moral right to political asylum. And it is a travesty, in a sense, an ironic travesty, that it was Russia who answered the call instead of the United States of America. I personally, as an American, am very sad about that, but I am glad that that right is not simply a notion that has no ability to be exercised anymore. And I think it's ironic that it's Russia, of all places. But that's still better than not exercising at all, and I'm glad that he is alive and free. And I joked about Disneyland, but the best thing to do now is to continue this. So if any of you have any documents you want to leak, I'm always happy to take them, to do something useful with them, and to make the maximum impact, which is the WikiLeaks promise.
Go ahead, next question, please.
Michael Mackey. I will feel the need to make a statement at some point. I always do. No pictures, please. It's not one of those occasions. The question is, do you see yourself as a journalist or a polemicist? Because you were esteemed as being from Occupy. Palin introduced you as a blogger, as a blogger and security specialist. And you seem to be offering a critique of the conventional media. So where exactly are you coming from this film? Because you work more or less shoulder to shoulder with The Guardian. And here's the statement coming up. I can't stand The Guardian. It's liberal elitism at its worst.
Okay,
I
I'll
could go on
summarize
for a
that for
long
you.
time about it.
I feel pretty similarly about The Guardian.
Are you a blogger, journalist, part of security?
Here's the thing. I'm a human being from planet Earth. That's where I'm at. I work as a journalist sometimes, and I've broken very large stories, not just with the Guardian. Actually, I never really worked with The Guardian directly. I worked with Der Spiegel mostly. The Guardian refused me protection during the beginning of this. They left me out in the cold. Alan Rusbridger did not care to give me a letter saying that I was a freelancer, even though I had classified documents. So I'm not a big fan of them. But in that context, I'm a journalist, but I'm also a human being. And we have a responsibility as journalists to recognize what it is that we do when we publish specific stories. What is the goal of that publication? When there are muckraking stories about Standard Oil, is the person who tells the story about serious labor abuses, are they no longer a human being? When they talk about those things, why are they talking about them? So am I a blogger? Yeah, I use the internet, but primarily I actually work in print publications in a German magazine, of all things. Just because I'm young doesn't mean I'm only using the internet. And so I think that the key thing is not, am I a journalist, but are you a human being? That's the question. And I am a human being, and I think it is important to work towards positive goals with the work as a journalist, which is what we have done with this film. But I'm also a little bit of a polemicist when I deal with people like you.
Next question, please.
Good comeback.
Yeah, quick question. Why don't you love freedom?
So everybody, if you don't know, this is the premier Thai arms dealer, the Grug. And so he's a really big fan of just sort of asking inflammatory questions. But if you're looking to secure your computer systems, he's the guy that sells governments weapons to break into them, especially if you're a journalist or a human rights activist. Oh, I'm sorry, that was a mistake. You don't sell them? You give it away?
Next question, please.
Got him.
Joe Arden, a member. You referred, I believe, and certainly Snowden did, and in my own view, he is a hero of first order. Let me note that to begin. That hopefully following whatever happened to Snowden, he noted in Hong Kong, that he hoped there would be others following him. That has not occurred in the 2 years, and in the 3 years or so, or 4 years since Manning. So one question is, why do you think that has not occurred? It would lead one to think that the actions taken by the U.S. government in the case of both Manning and in the case of Snowden, have made other people less willing on very serious national security. And I agree with you in terms of the use of the word freedom and liberty as opposed to the use of the term privacy. It seemingly has made people less willing, perhaps, to come forward, number one. And number two, I'm sure there must have been polls earlier, but I have not read any recently. In your own view, if there was to be a vote of the American public, a referendum, to the question of do you approve or disapprove of what Snowden did, what do you think the results would be?
Well, that's actually a very great question. I'm really glad you asked it. And the first part of the question, what I would say is at the end of the film, they show that there is in fact another source. So there are more people that are coming forward. And I think it's strange though, the way that the film talks about sourcing and the way that people in general speculate about second source, third source. There are a lot of people that come forward. And it was a mistake in some ways to think that the way that someone talks about one source, in the case of Snowden, means that if you don't have people talking about sources exactly that same way all the time, that there's really only Snowden. And this is a problem in general with hero culture. And I think it's important to note there are a lot of sources, not one or two or three, but hundreds of sources. But not many people want to be like Snowden or make the impact like Snowden. Everybody wants to give a little piece at a time and keep going. Because a lot of people, even Snowden, want to fix the machine, not just tear it down, right? They want to make it work. And fundamentally, that's one of the things that I think is really great about Snowden. He's a super incredible American patriot who believes the Constitution should exist and protect all people regardless of where they're born. So there are other sources that come forward. But the perception, you're correct, is that there aren't a lot of extra sources. But there really are. In Germany, for example, there have been people leaking documents about German spying. In America, more American spying. British, the same. And there are intelligence officers who understand operational security. And there are some journalists that understand that as well. And that allows for, let's say, some journalists to receive those sources. A really big blockade on journalists, though, is that they have a GSM telephone. And they say, hey, call me if you want to meet. If you are dealing with the intelligence community, and that is how you meet the person, you have already given them up to the authorities. So it is important to understand that there are some from the older generation of journalists that I work with, even in Germany, who, unless they're basically doing everything offline all the time, they tend to not attract some of the more technologically sophisticated actors. And then those actors also, the ones who are technologically sophisticated, often don't want to end up living in Russia. And they want less publicity. And I think that's fair. Didn't address your entire question.
The second part of the question, what do you think would happen if there were a referendum approving or disapproving Snowden's actions?
That's kind of like asking whether or not we should have a vote on slavery when it comes to America. It doesn't matter, for example, if it's economically viable. I mean, if the American people don't care what Snowden has done, don't care that he's revealed actual legality, it is irrelevant. The law is actually pretty clear. The Constitution, the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Bill of Rights is pretty clear. But that said, I think the stats are actually in his favor, which is kind of amazing. But I don't think that matters, because part of the thing that we see with the U.S. government here is that what the United States, what the people of the United States think, is not actually always the thing that drives what the United States does. And part of what Snowden has done is to show exactly that. So hopefully we can change not just the opinion polls to be more in his favor, but to actually change the system to make it more accountable.
Okay, next question, please.
Hey, first, I'd like to say thank you for everything you've done for enhancing privacy and helping to spread the word of what's been going on with Snowden. Two questions. First, are there any leaks that you're aware of regarding the surveillance infrastructure in Thailand, particularly the new system that started testing in September? And my second question is, have you thought about the next stage of what we do after all the information sinks in? How we start fighting back more actively to move into a more privacy-aware future?
Thank you for those questions. The answer to the first question is really easy. It's nope, I don't know anything about leaks. Certainly not about Thailand. Just lucky me on that one. I don't want to know anything about Thai leaks also. Just for the record, there are some really good journalists in this room who are probably much better at that than I am. The second part of your question is a really difficult one, and whenever I answer it, guys like the guy in the corner over there that asked if I was just a polemicist sort of take issue with me. But what I would say is, I think it is important to realize that everyone is impacted by surveillance. So telling your friends and your family members is an important next step. Getting them to see this film is, of course, something that I think is great. But really getting people to understand that they're impacted, and getting people to understand that in a concrete way and being involved with their governments in a democratic way, I think is really key. There's some technological issues. I think it's important to use strong cryptography, but nonetheless, that in itself does not make a world of change. Each one of those things is useful, but we really need cultural changes, we need economic incentives to change. There are lots of steps. So we need to have people making not just movies and films, but we need to be seeing street art. We need to integrate all of these things all across the board in culture. In finance, we need to make sure that we use what currently is being used by the surveillance infrastructure. We actually use that in an advantageous way to actually work on, let's say, counter-surveillance or liberty-based technologies. And I think that there are lots of fields where we could discuss that, forever. Actually, there's a lot of things about that. But if we look at the history of social change with regard to social justice, it becomes very clear that we have a lot of work to do across the board. Probably the most important thing that I would say, though, is that people like General Alexander must not be allowed to have impunity. It should not be the case that myself, Laura, Glenn, and others have to work as journalists outside of the United States to work on these issues. And people like General Alexander not only travel freely, but they sell their knowledge. General Alexander himself was receiving $600,000 a month, I believe, in consulting fees, for example, talking about the same issues. I think that's kind of amazing in that what could he possibly be doing except fiscalizing his knowledge? Why is it that when he lies to Congress, he's free to do that, and I live in exile? Personally, I think that part of that means we have to end the impunity, and that requires a rule of law with very specific democratic oversight. And if we don't have that, we also can look to history to see what happens to guys like that next.
Thank you. Next question, please.
My name's Andrew Burton. I'm not a journalist. First of all, thank you for the wonderful film. I really enjoyed it. It's fantastic. On the subject of government wrongdoing and how all this has happened pursuant to 9/11, do you believe the government's accounts of what happened on 9/11? Even?
There you go.
Are you asking me if I believe that some airplanes flew into a building? I don't know what your view of the account is, but my view of the account is that the United States had a military coup, and it just happened to happen at the same time as a terrorist attack, and that they were waiting with the Patriot Act already written. There are always fascists in waiting who want to take power, and I think it's very important to remember that regardless of the details of how the attacks happened, what happened in the aftermath is clear, and there's delineated responsibility for those things. So Rudy Giuliani, I don't think he had anything to do with 9/11, but I know that he had everything to do with what happened next. And that is what matters. We don't need to solve the mystery of 9/11. I actually think it's pretty solved. What we need to solve, though, is why we tolerated what came next, knowing that it did not eliminate the risk, and it did not bring the perpetrators to justice, any of them. If you believe that Osama bin Laden, for example, is responsible for 9/11, as I do, it is a great travesty that he was assassinated instead of being put on trial. We put people like Eichmann on trial, who are low-level bureaucrats of no importance at all, essentially. For him to not have it means we have lost closure. The people that made those decisions should also be put on trial. This is absolutely critical for not only emotional closure, but for moving on, and to not repeat it. To not actually let whoever, I think Al-Qaeda, frankly, but to not let those people actually destroy not only American society, but the rest of the world. And the US has really, sadly, chosen a path of vengeance and anger instead of justice. And most of the people of my generation don't care, which really makes me sad. I mean, when I mentioned that Osama bin Laden was assassinated, I've had people spit in my face about that. But that's true, that's what happened. I mean, I don't shed a tear for him, but I do shed a tear for our democracy and our justice system when that is the moral ground on which we lay our authority. And we set that as the example for the rest of the world. I mean, it kind of sets the stage actually for people assassinating people like General Alexander, for example, right? That's what America has turned into, and I don't want that world. I want to see a better world. But that's part of why I moved to Germany, because in Germany, they learned these lessons the hard way, and the US helped them rewrite their constitution. Actually, pretty impressive if you read it. It's better than in the original, like most things in German. But we have to see a rebirth of those values and a reemergence of that. We have to see people doubling down on the Court of Human Rights and the Court of Justice in Europe. And we need to see that happen. That is actually what is the most important thing for us to do next. And if we do not do that, I think in a lot of places we will see intelligence agencies running policy instead of policy running intelligence agencies. And part of what Snowden has shown is the beginning of that. We're not at the end yet.
So no coincidence between the two. Just feel one was already in the works.
I think we'll go to the next question. Thank you.
Jonathan Head from the BBC. Jacob, particularly with WikiLeaks, we saw a huge trove of information that was released, fascinating stuff. But of course, in the case of WikiLeaks, there were huge numbers of confidential conversations between embassies and sources that are very useful in terms of hearing things that you wouldn't hear unless these people speaking to the embassy staff knew they were speaking in confidence. Once that was leaked, of course, that confidence is broken. We know that may well be the case here in Thailand. How do you weigh up that obvious need to want to know more about what these embassies and government agencies are doing and hearing, with the fact that there are sometimes genuine cases for confidentiality?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I wish that Julian could actually be here to answer that question in detail, because I myself didn't make those editorial decisions. But my feel on this is that the diplomatic cables, so-called Cablegate, as it has been referred to by many people, including WikiLeaks, one of the key points is that those cables are contexts. And those are important contexts to understand the situation. If you look at the death of the king of Saudi Arabia, for example, which is a very huge event in Saudi Arabia and around the world, the New York Times article about that used the cables extensively to write that. There are also serious crimes that have taken place where those cables also set the context. It is true that there is a need for certain confidentiality, and there's no doubt about that. But it's also true that there is an importance for understanding history and understanding the grounds and the context in which events occur. And I know it's really embarrassing to Hillary Clinton, and good luck to her in her presidential run, but I think it was even Eric Schmidt that suggested if she didn't want people to know those things, maybe she shouldn't have written them down. And maybe if she didn't want people to know those things, she wouldn't have made sure that they could be shared with 6 million other people. I mean, the big lie is that it was a secret to begin with. Most of those things were not even classified at a, say, top secret or secret level. Most of them were less than that. In fact, I think there were no top secrets in that Cablegate release. But of course, there's a tension there. But there's also a question about accountability. What happens in secret diplomatic backrooms? Does that really represent the American people? I think often it doesn't. When Hillary Clinton, for example, instructs people to get fingerprints and personal information to task for surveillance, how do you suppose they spied on Chancellor Merkel? How did they get the people that were around Merkel? Well, the way they did that is they used their diplomatic and political arms to get that information and then put that into the signals intelligence system. So it actually ties together. Obviously, I think you have to do a case-by-case analysis on that. In the case of Cablegate, there were a number of cables that were held back for harm reduction reasons. You hear a lot of talking points about, oh, well, what about informants' names and so on and so forth, particularly in the Iraq war logs and the Afghan war diaries, those WikiLeaks releases. I think it is, of course, very important to think case by case. WikiLeaks has never at any point in time advocated for not thinking. The whole purpose of WikiLeaks is to enable people with information to be able to think more accurately. And so you can check the facts, because every journalist has the tendency to be a polemicist. It is with the base information being available to us that we're able to actually vet and check and understand the interpretation of that data.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Overwhelming documentary. Robert Kinnear, Alternative Innovations. I was just wondering if you've got any suggestions to the NSA how they can improve their surveillance so they can actually join the dots of the bits of information that they do gather, rather than just swamping themselves with so much. And that's regarding to an earlier question regarding 9/11. There's clearly a lot of information available prior to that happening. Could they not have fixed that? And sort of in the same line, what about weapons of mass destruction that supposedly triggered the Iraq war? There must have been a lot of information available about the veracity of that being the case. In your comment. Thank you.
So I think it's important to focus on things that actually matter, not just things that are possibilities for being done. So for example, monitoring the SOFAR channel, which is the region of the ocean in which you can tell if someone has used an atomic weapon underwater to be able to know that these tests are happening. There's also collection sensors in Antarctica and other places to see when an event has occurred, an atomic event. I don't think all surveillance is bad. That's an example of a very specific targeted thing which allows for not only political but technical repercussions. I think that those kinds of surveillance are not only important, I think they're necessary for maintaining peace and stability. But a lot of the NSA surveillance is not that. It's bulk collection of all things. And it's just because it is possible. And it's a Confucian principle, which is that whatever is inevitable is immoral to resist. And I reject that principle. I think Confucius was wrong. And I think that it is important to see that most of the NSA surveillance was about connecting the dots, and they missed it. The CIA and the FBI and the NSA had data on a lot of the 9/11 hijackers. And just to make it clear, I actually do believe what the 9/11 Commission has revealed about those attacks. I think actually they should reveal more. I think they kept too much secret, and I think that's harmful for our democracy as well. But connecting those dots is important, and a big part of that is doing necessary and proportionate collection, and ensuring also a balance. So for example, it is the case that because the FBI wants to wiretap me, everyone's cell phone in this room is vulnerable to everybody else. The Chinese, the Thai, myself, me. I can do it. That's not necessary and proportionate in my opinion. I think that that's a difficult problem to solve though when you have a bunch of data and you need to sew it together with analysis. But one of the things we might try, which is a radical notion, is to eliminate the root cause of some of these issues. And that's something which you don't hear a lot of politicians talking about. But the reason you have groups like Al-Shabaab is because the conditions there are so awful that it looks like a good choice to join Al-Shabaab, that it looks like a good idea to join Boko Haram. That's a really serious problem which is not being addressed. And you don't address that with surveillance, you address that with economic and social justice. And I think that that's really what we are missing. And so what we should do is not look to make surveillance and its analysis more effective. We should look to make the world a more just place in a very specific set of economic and social circumstances. And I know that sounds like a bunch of hokey, hand-wavy nonsense, but I really think that it is important to look at that. These guys have a lot of data and a lot of analysis. There are a lot of people in this room that are on watch lists with huge dossiers. And not just me, probably people you wouldn't imagine would be that. And I think that that's a problem. To have a secret police-based society is really scary. So maybe we don't work on helping them to do things where they're going to abuse those techniques and use them against their political enemies. Maybe instead we encourage them to work on things where we can be happy if they take it to the fullest extent of the possibility.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi, Jacob. My name is Dazanne McLean. I'm a freelance journalist from New York, but I live in Hong Kong. And I want to change the subject a little bit. For those of us who are from Hong Kong, one can't help but look at the film Citizenfour with a bit of nostalgia, because even though the events have only taken place 2 years ago, the kind of atmosphere that exists in Hong Kong now, particularly with regard to police presence and secrecy and so forth, has quite changed. Seeing as how you were part, well, two things. One is that I wondered if you had any insight into why Snowden chose Hong Kong. It's something I've been wondering myself for years, what led to his choosing that place as opposed to any of the other places he could have chose. And the other thing is that as you were a part of the Occupy movement in New York, which is also my hometown, if you had any thoughts on the Occupy movement in Hong Kong and in Occupy movements in general, since the whole thrust of these surveillance techniques are ultimately to keep people from grabbing back power, how is it even possible for movements like Occupy to resist and to fight that? It seems in many ways the scope of it is so broad of the surveillance that it makes it impossible for people to do anything to rebalance the out of balance power that we have in our world today.
Yeah, so I've not really had extensive discussions with Snowden about why Hong Kong. My general feel about that, though, is obviously that he's a smart guy and he wanted to buy himself some time. And my view is that there is a strong political freedom tendency in history in a bunch of places in the world. But there are not a lot of places in the world where the US wouldn't roll in and grab him. Not easily, I would say. And there is proof that after Snowden, made it to Moscow, that the US government did in fact dispatch a private jet. There's a film called Snowden's Great Escape, made by the fantastic Berlin-based director, journalist, John Gutz. He's really, I mean, he's an amazing guy. He wasn't the director of that film, but he is an incredible investigative journalist. And so I think that part of the decision there was to look at history and see where he might be able to buy himself a couple of days to talk to some journalists. And I think that was his actual goal. If his goal was to, not, for example, not buy himself just some time, but to buy himself a lot longer, he probably would have tried to go somewhere else. So it really tells you about how he made his plans, which is that he really didn't even try to save himself. He tried to make a series of points which would drive home the importance of the things that he was revealing. And I think he thought he'd be off the world stage pretty quickly. I think he probably even thought he'd be killed even in Hong Kong. It's not impossible to imagine that the US assassinates its own citizens. That is a reality this year, last year, and so on. So I think that that was part of it. And the second part about Occupy, I don't know. I think that Occupy in particular is a really interesting experiment, and I think it's good, but the reality of the situation in the US is that it's not conducive to democratic activities. I mean, the US government has had some pretty awful stuff against Occupy. In particular, when there have been threats of violence against leaders of Occupy, the US government has not offered them protection. And in one case, as far as I understand it, they even didn't mention it to the people that were targeted, such that they could have been seriously harmed. And I think that that suggests that we need not only a mass action like Occupy, but we also need clandestine activity. If we look, for example, to the African National Congress, we see that the reason that they were able to take down apartheid is because for 70 years, the ANC and groups like the ANC, including MK, they worked tirelessly to try to bring the government to the table to negotiate about apartheid. And I think when it comes to other issues of social justice, you require mass action and clandestine action. So we need people like the burglars from 1971 in Media, Pennsylvania to break into the FBI offices and show the crimes that the government is committing and to turn the country around just as much as we need Occupy people to sit there in meetings and discuss what it is we want in a democratic way. But no matter what, anyone who engages in those things is going to have a real hard life. And that's the path they're going to have to choose. And that's a hard one. And I actually wouldn't advise that to almost anyone. It's really hard, but I think it would be great if people did it. And I hope they will, and they'll follow the example of Snowden if they're in the government especially. He and also Chelsea Manning are great heroes in my opinion.
Well, thanks for choosing it yourself.
Okay, next question please, thank you.
We're good.
My name is George Rothschild, and I'm a journalist. The only question I have is whether Snowden inspired whistleblowers in non-Western countries.
Well, I think yes. And I sure hope so. I've talked with people outside of what you call Western countries. And if it's one thing that's clear, it's that people really believe that they can make a difference for their own country, often by leaving that country and doing something really bold and getting somewhere else to stay safe. And there are people that do that. I'm very curious to find out about the South African leaks that Al Jazeera has been publishing, for example. I really hope that that's another Snowden-like person and that they have already gotten themselves to safety. I don't know if that's true. I don't know any details about it. I've just been reading a little bit about it as it's been trickling out. But I think that what Snowden has done by surviving is that he has, in fact, changed the perspective. If you can survive the US government coming after you like that, you can probably survive the government of, I don't know, South Africa, for example. So I think that that's good, and I think Snowden has emboldened other people. But I don't know. We'll see what happens. If we, again, look to South Africa, with the ANC, there are a lot of people that took a lot of risks and they actually paid with their lives. So not everyone will be the example that Snowden presents, and maybe even not Snowden in the long run. But again, that's not the only reason to do it, right? It's not to survive, it's to do the right thing and maybe to win for a little while.
Now Jacob does have a flight to catch later on tonight, so we'll only take a couple of more questions. Nobody at the mic. I'll ask about,
There's one more.
oh yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Maher. I'm a freelance journalist. I'd just like to know who you think in the U.S. government, other than General Alexander, should face impeachment proceedings or legal proceedings based on the evidence that's been provided by WikiLeaks and Snowden.
Well, I think when Clapper was rubbing himself bald in front of Congress, that was the worst tell a spy ever had. That is clear he should face some serious questioning and actually charges. I think maybe arresting him without possibility for bail, like they want to do to Snowden, would be good. Maybe keep him in communicado a little bit. Just kidding about that. But I think Clapper's a good example, Alexander's a good example, but Obama is also a good example. And so is Hayden, Tennant, Nancy Pelosi, the rest of the people that were in on it, the Gang of Eight, for example. There is a set of people in the Intelligence Select Committee that knew about mass bulk interception of the entire American population. They know about drone politics and the assassination memos that are still not public. Those people should be held accountable for violating fundamental civil liberties of Americans and people all around the world. And that's just a legal fact. And right now they have impunity. So look at who's been in power in the last 10 years, and the people that are the most cleared are probably the most serious offenders of that. And we see that from the evidence. Nancy Pelosi is